I never understood these myths or rumors that we have about certain Pokemon that are like, we have no idea what it really looks like. I mean, yes, for some of the more mystical Pokemon that makes sense, because they can affect the mind more easily than most others. Some examples of those that make sense are Mimikyu or what the inside of a Shedinja looks like. But when you're talking about something like the subject of today's guide, it makes no sense. We have people that are actively raising and breeding them, scientists that have studied them over the years, and they don't even have any abilities like ghosts or psychic types that can affect another's mental state. I can only assume that these rumors are born out of ignorance, and that makes these guides that I make feel all the more important. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the vine-covered Pokemon Tangela and its evolution Tangrowth. Tangela is a round Pokemon that stands about 3 feet tall, or 1 meter, and weighs an average of 77 pounds, 35 kilograms. Tangela has a round body that is covered by blue-green vines that grow from its body, with 2 red feet that stick out from the bottom that kind of look like boots. It also has 2 eyes that peek out of the vines in the front of the Pokemon. And before we get any further into the guide, I'm going to point out that this is where the rumor that I mentioned in the intro comes into play. There is this weird rumor that exists that we don't know what the internal body of a Tangela looks like beneath the vines. It's just not true. Underneath the vines, Tangela has a round black body with spots where the vines grow out of. It looks weird, don't get me wrong, but it's no big mystery like the rumor says it is. Now, when a Tangela learns the move Ancient Power, it unlocks a dormant gene in their genetics, much like it does for the Swinub line and the Yanma line, or how Rollout allows Lickitung evolve into a Licky. This allows the Pokemon to evolve into a Tangrowth. The second evolution grows massively in size, now standing 6 foot 7 inches tall, 2 meters, and 283.5 pounds, or 128.6 kilos. And trust me, it looks like it too. Tangrowth now has a large ovoid body, still covered in the same blue-green vines, with 2 small stub-like legs at the bottom. It now also has 2 long and thin arms that are formed from the vines covering its body. The ends of its nub legs and the fingers on its hands are both tipped in bright red, with the females having more red on their fingers than the males. And yes, before you ask, we know what Tangrowth looks like under the vines as well. It's the same as Tangela, just a black body that the vines grow from. In all, some very simple biology, but does that simplicity translate into their care? Let's get into it and see if these Pokemon could possibly be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. I'm sure many people, myself included, would think that these Pokemon tend to live in warm, moist environments, places like jungles where vines are more common. But in actuality, these Pokemon tend to live in more temperate grasslands with occasional populations found in temperate forests. And for our purposes, that's good, because it means that you could keep these Pokemon in your backyard relatively easily, so long as you make a few accommodations. One is space. Thanks to how these Pokemon eat, they tend not to move. These Pokemon are surprisingly omnivorous, eating not only fruit and plants, but also preying on small Pokemon as well. And they do this through the use of their highly mobile and extremely stretchy vines. Because of this extreme reach they possess, and the short stubby legs that can make long periods of movement tough and slow, these Pokemon have developed a method that's very close to most ambush predators, and in actuality is very close to how Lickitung feed. Because of this lack of movement, they don't actually have to have too much space for themselves. If you keep a Tangela in a yard that's at least 25 feet on all sides, or 7.6 meters per side, then that should be plenty of room for them. Now, Tangrowth is much larger, with better legs and a larger need for food, so they do actually move more than their previous evolution, meaning that they'll need a yard that's at least double in size, having to be at least 50 feet on all sides or 15.2 meters. It's quite a bit of space, but then again, like I always say, fully evolved Pokemon tend to take up a lot of resources to care for. Fencing should be good enough to keep these Pokemon in, so long as you get the fencing that are really tall and don't have enough space for these Pokemon to slip their vines through and pull the fence apart. The other thing that you have to focus on when it comes to their enclosure is the environment itself. One of the major factors you'll have to look out for is how wet the ground is. These Pokemon pull a lot of their water from the ground, so it's important for you to make sure that their enclosure always has damp soil. If you end up having a few long periods of time where you get no rainfall, or live in a place where you get very little rainfall all year round, then you may have to make accommodations for these Pokemon, whether that be through watering the ground yourself, or installing a water feature like a pond that can slowly feed into the surrounding ground. This also brings me to the second part of their environment, grass. Like I said before, the temperate grasslands are where you'll most commonly find these Pokemon. They use the tall grasses to help hide themselves from their prey. Now, I'm not saying that you have to allow your grass to grow to the point where you can't see your Pokemon and you feel like a Pyroar is stalking you. But you will need to have your grass grow to be kinda shaggy. I'd say that instead of the average of mowing at least once a week, bring that down to every 2 or 3 weeks, and bring the height of the mower up to the highest length that you can do. This should provide a comfy place for your Pokemon to live without your lawn becoming uncontrollable. And really, that's it. These Pokemon are fairly simple when it comes to what they need in their environment to survive. The last thing that we're going to talk about here are the other Pokemon that can be housed with them. One of the main things that you want to avoid are small prey Pokemon, along the lines of Caterpie or Rattata. Those are the kinds of Pokemon that the Tangela line prey on, and it's never a good thing to suddenly be missing another Pokemon under suspicious circumstances. And for Tangrowth especially, that list of prey expands to cover even larger prey Pokemon such as Raticate and some of the medium-sized bug Pokemon. On the flip side though, you should also avoid any fire, poison, or large bug-type Pokemon, as they can very easily cause massive harm to your Tangela evolution. You should also avoid any of the larger herbivore Pokemon. As we'll see later on in the care guide, it doesn't hurt the Tangela line to have their vines trimmed or cut, but if they're losing vines because another Pokemon is eating them, then that may lead to the Pokemon starting to panic and starting a fight. Really, your best bet is to have Pokemon of roughly equal size to your Tangela evolution that won't try to eat or fight your Tangela Pokemon, or your Tangela Pokemon won't try to eat them in turn. I know that really limits your pool of potential cohabitants, but I'm sure that there are some out there. It does seem like the Tangela line would be good to house with each other, though you will have to increase the amount of space for them. As far as I can tell, they aren't communal by nature, but have no problems being in close proximity to each other or sharing territory if that's what you want to do. Availability. Due to the restrictive nature of these Pokemon's environment, they haven't spread too much from the isolated areas that they exist in. They tend to live in places near bodies of water and in grasses, such as the northern part of Route 21 in Kanto, up near Pallet Town, or Route 13 in Unova, along with some of the giant chasm north of that, and Route 44 near Mahogany Town in Johto. There are also scattered reports of them being found in trees all around the Kanto region, though those are unconfirmed and unreliable at best, and then there are reports that they can be found in and around Mount Silver. Unfortunately, because that place is restricted to only the toughest trainers that have proven they can handle the extremely aggressive Pokemon and tough environment, there are only a handful of reports and sightings from that place, and the average person, or even average trainer, won't be allowed access to catch a Tangela there, even if they are available. And then, the rest of the regions don't have any natural populations of these Pokemon. Though, I should mention the Sinnoh region does stock these Pokemon in Pastoria's Great Marsh, which isn't the best environment for them, but also isn't the worst. Thankfully, in the places where these Pokemon do live, they have a fairly decent population size. If you go to any of the places that I mentioned, then you should be able to easily find a wild Tangela. Though, I should mention that it's mostly Tangela you'll find in the wild, not Tangrowth. It's very rare for a wild Tangela to learn the move Ancient Power and unlock their ancient genetics and evolve on their own. Most trainer-raised Tangela have to be put through some special training to help them learn the move and evolve, hence making it very hard to find a wild Tangrowth. Which brings us to the breeding scene, and really, it's not that much different than the wild. These Pokemon are very middle-of-the-road Pokemon to have, not too hard to care for or train, but also not the most popular Pokemon in the world. Same goes for trainers that use these Pokemon for battling. They are decently strong, but they aren't the most powerful Grass-type Pokemon out there. So you end up with these Pokemon falling very much in the middle of the road when it comes to breeders raising them. If you want a breeder-raised one, which I always recommend, then you might have to do a bit of searching for them online, but they won't be too hard to find, and the Pokemon shouldn't be too expensive to own. The only thing that I might see being tough to get a hold of is Tangrowth. Finding someone who can do the extra training the Pokemon needs to evolve is fairly rare and not cheap, meaning that the cost of the effort and training is going to be passed on to you, and it might be a specially ordered Pokemon. I don't see a breeder going through all that hassle and cost of evolving a Tangela without a guarantee that they'll be able to recoup their expenses by selling it. Catchability. One of the major things to remember when you go out to catch one of these Pokemon is that they are very good at blending into their environment. Their vines are plant matter, and with them covering their entire body, combined with the fact that these Pokemon don't move too much, and you might have a hard time distinguishing them from the surrounding environment. However, aside from that, catching one of these Pokemon should be a very basic, standard catching experience. Aside from Mount Silver, these Pokemon don't live in very dangerous areas, so you shouldn't be in too much danger when out hunting for them. That being said, you should always be prepared for other wild Pokemon to cause you issues. Be sure to bring a Pokemon of your own to protect you and inform people where you're going and when you expect to be back. When it comes to tackling and defending yourself from these Pokemon, you'll want a decently strong Pokemon that has abilities that are super effective against them, which shouldn't be too hard to find. Grass is one of those types that has a lot of weaknesses, so anything that has fire, bug, poison, or flying type abilities should be effective at battling a Tangela or the rare Tangrowth. As for what to use to catch them, I would say that a Tangela straddles the line between a Pokeball and a Great Ball, and if you do end up finding and wanting to catch a wild Tangrowth, then you should absolutely use an Ultra Ball. Care. Let's just get food out of the way in the beginning. As I said before, these Pokemon are omnivores, picking fruit and veggies from the surrounding environment, as well as catching the occasional prey for supplemental protein and other nutrients. Meaning that you could go one of two ways. For those of you that don't feel comfortable feeding meat to your Pokemon, you could go with the entirely vegetarian option, using fruits and veggies and then giving them protein and calcium supplements to make up for the lack in their diet. In that case, you should give them about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of mixed fruit for Tangela, giving twice a day, morning and evening, or 0.68 kilos to 0.9 kilos for those that use the metric system. If you have them evolve into a Tangrowth, then you'll need to increase that to about 3 pounds of food a day, or 1.36 kilos. Same things, mixed fruit and 2 meals a day. And then for the supplements, there should be instructions on the back of the supplement bottle that tell you how much to use. It can really vary between brands and what kind of supplement. For those of you that don't mind feeding your Pokemon meat, or would prefer to use less supplements, then there are a few differences between the two. One is the amount of food they'll be eating. Meat is much more calorically dense than fruit or veggies are, so if you were to end up giving them the same amount of food that you do when it's just fruit, then your Pokemon will very quickly end up getting overweight. To that end, for a Tangela, you'll be giving them about a pound of food, or 0.5 kilos, with that being about 1/3 meat and the rest being fruit and veggies. This will still be twice a day. Tang growth will cause that to increase to about 2.5 pounds, 1.13 kilos. Still 1/3 meat to 2/3 fruits and veggies, and given twice a day. Thanks to this, you'll be able to skip the protein supplements, but you'll still have to give them the calcium supplements. They normally get that from eating the bones from their prey in the wild, but that can end up being a major choking hazard, so I'm going to recommend skipping that for captivity. Oh, and you can really feed them in any old food dish. They should be fine just taking their food out of that. Moving past the food, one of the major parts of caring for these Pokemon is trimming their vines. Don't worry, this isn't going to hurt them. Much like how the Bulbasaur line shed the leaves or petals of their flowers, Tangela and Tangrowth both need their vines to be trimmed and cut back to remain healthy. Normally, in the wild, this would happen either through other Pokemon getting into a fight with the Tangela evolution or munching on the vines, or it would be through natural wear and tear as they use them to move through the environment. However, in captivity, this doesn't really happen as often as it does in the wild, leading to a bit of overgrowth in the vines. You'll notice over time that instead of a tight ball of vines surrounding the Pokemon's body, some of the vines are starting to stick out and hang out from the body, almost like when we get frizzy hair. They'll start to droop down by the feet and even get in the Pokemon's eyes, making it hard for the Pokemon to see. In extreme cases where captive Tangela haven't been trimmed in very long, then the weight of the vines could end up weighing the Pokemon down and inhibiting movement. Granted, that is more of a concern for Tangela than Tangrowth. You would really have to let a Tangrowth go for a long time for it to reach the point where the weight of the vines starts to affect it. As well, Tangrowth will use their arms, which are also composed of the vines, to tear and rip away from their own vines if left for too long. It won't look pretty, like going to a hedge with a weed whacker, but they'll take care of it themselves. Oh, and I should mention that Tangrowth, that because their arms are made of vines coming from their bodies, it's possible that the arms might come off as well. It usually happens in the wild when a predator gets into a fight with the Tangrowth, but in captivity, they have been known to rip their own arms off. I know that sounds terrible, but it doesn't hurt the Pokemon at all, and it's only because the arms can get too long and too heavy for them to use. It's not like bird Pokemon that get so stressed that they pull out their own feathers. That's horrible and comes from poor care and enclosure conditions. The arm thing with Tangrowth is just the Pokemon performing body maintenance and can even be avoided with proper trimming of the Pokemon's vines. On the plus side, moving away from that disturbing imagery, it's well known that Tangela and Tangrowth's vines are popular spices in Galar, and plenty of people find them tasty on their own. It might be a bit weird to eat something that you trimmed off your Pokemon, but if you want to sell it, or even if you don't mind eating it yourself, it's a nice thing to do with the trimmed off ends. This leads to the obvious conclusion that you'll have to trim the Pokemon's vines. Of course, you could always take them to a professional groomer. That would be the easiest way, if not the cheapest. But for those of you that want to try taking care of this at home, then you need to start small. You'll first have to get the Pokemon used to you not only being around it, but also get it comfortable with you touching it and handling its vines. To that end, you're going to start with the food. When you bring the food into the enclosure, try to get as close to the Pokemon as you can. These Pokemon aren't exactly known for being shy, even the wild ones, but any Pokemon who isn't used to humanity might be a little skittish in the beginning. Go slow, don't make any sudden moves or loud noises, and use the food as an incentive to get them to come closer. It might not work right away, but find out where the limit is for your Pokemon and work from there. Every day, try to get closer, and when you see that the Pokemon is getting ready to bolt, then place the food down and take a few steps back. Let the Pokemon come to you and to the food. This will help to reinforce the idea that, 1, you were the source of food for them here and therefore are a good thing, and that 2, you are not there to attack or threaten it. Over time, as the Pokemon gets more and more used to you, you'll be able to move closer and closer until you are within touching distance of the Pokemon. The same goes for getting to touch the Pokemon itself. Go slowly, speak softly, and use the food as positive reinforcement, and be gentle when you first start doing this. Be sure not to break off any of their vines at this point. Like I said, they might take that as you trying to attack them or eat their vines, and it might backtrack the training at that point. You want to establish a strong bond of trust with them before you ever try to trim their vines. Given enough time and patience, you will reach that point, but it might end up taking a lot of effort. The only thing that might be different from what I laid out here is if you're working with a Tangrowth. Tangrowth are much bigger and stronger than Tangela is, and therefore are more likely to be willing to stand their ground and get aggressive as opposed to running away from you. It's like a 50-50 chance between the two outcomes, but always be prepared with the Pokemon's Pokeball just in case it starts to make aggressive moves towards you. That's why it's usually best to do this training with a Tangela, and then, once you're sure that they're okay with you being around, evolve them into a Tangrowth. Less hassle for you to deal with overall if you do it that way. Cost. Because the enclosure is just your backyard, no special attachments, nothing that needs to be built or installed, then you shouldn't need to put too much cost into it. The most that you'll have to do is maybe have a fence or barrier installed, but I'm assuming since it's your yard that you've already had something along those lines. If you don't, then yeah, things can get up into the moderate or high range, but if that's something that you don't really have to worry about, then this should be in the low or even the very low category. Food will probably cost you the most here, especially if you decide to go with the meat option. The vegetarian diet with supplements will bring the price down, due to the simple fact that fruits and veggies are less expensive than meat. If you're doing the veggie diet, then you'll probably be spending in the moderate category per month, and the high category per month if you have the meat option. Also, those values are for Tangela. If you have a Tangrowth, then you should bump each one up one category on the price scale. The Pokemon itself shouldn't be too bad. Thanks to their easy nature and the fact that they can be very low maintenance if you want them to be, I don't see a breeder charging you more than the moderate category for a Tangela. Where it might get expensive is getting a Tangrowth. Unless it's one of the rare times where the Pokemon was able to learn the move naturally, then you'll have to send the Pokemon out to get specially trained to learn the move Ancient Power so that they then can evolve, which can end up being a very expensive process. And of course, all that effort and expense is going to get added onto the cost of the Pokemon, bringing the price for a Tangrowth up to the high or maybe even the very high category. Conclusion. I think these Pokemon would be good Pokemon for someone who wants a Pokemon that not many people have, yet also wants one that isn't a lot of work or time investment if you're busy. They're easy to care for, they can really take care of themselves, and the only major thing you have to watch for, the grooming, can be done just through taking the Pokemon to a groomer. The only thing that I can see being an issue for someone when it comes to these Pokemon is how they look and move, because I know there are people out there that can be creeped out by the prehensile vines they have. If that's not you, and you are looking for a simple grass-type Pokemon to take care of, then these Pokemon could easily become the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the caring, motherly Pokemon Kangaskhan. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Baby Pokemon aren't that common in the grand scheme of things. Only a handful out of all the species we've documented even have the ability to produce a baby Pokemon. And even then, it's usually only under weird circumstances during the breeding process. So it's very rare for a Pokemon to not only have a baby Pokemon variation of itself, but for that form to be the natural stage of the Pokemon's life, and for the Pokemon to not evolve like other Pokemon do, but to slowly develop as they age, much like we humans do. As far as I can tell, they are the only Pokemon that go through this form of development, though if I'm wrong, I'm sure that Dan will correct me down in the comments. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the marsupial mother Pokemon Kangaskhan. Kangaskhan are large bipedal Pokemon with the normal 2 arms, 2 legs, and a tail. They are predominantly brown in color, with a cream belly and patches of armor like plates on its shoulder and its knees. Kangaskhan also has 3 sharp claws or talons on their hands and feet each. Their head is very oblong with a large mouth, small red eyes, and 2 large cream-colored ears on either side of its dark patch on the top of its head. And as a final note, they all have a pouch on their belly, a fold of skin that forms a pocket that allows babies of the species to be carried around with their mother. And when I say that they are large, I mean it. These Pokemon stand at a tall 7 feet 3 inches, 2.2 meters, and weigh about the same as the average human male, about 176.4 pounds or 80 kilograms. In all, a very large Pokemon, even if it is a single stage Pokemon. Before we move on, I do want to touch more on the whole baby thing. After all, this Pokemon is very well known to be the parent Pokemon. However, this guide is going to be about the adult and only the adult. The main reason for that is that nobody should be raising a baby Kangaskhan aside from those at certain sanctuaries. Thanks to their undeveloped state, the baby can't be separated from its mother without putting the baby at extreme risk. They can't feed themselves, they can't defend themselves, and even in the beginning of its life, it isn't even able to walk. A baby Kangaskhan without a mother Kangaskhan to take care of it, even under the care of specialists and professionals, it's very touch and go if it's going to make it through childhood. They need specialized food, need to be very careful about how it's raised so it can be released back into the wild, and have it know how to care for itself and interact with others of its kind. It's so much work and takes a lot of knowledge. I have immense respect for the professionals that do this. Even with all my years of working with Pokemon, and from what I've learned doing these guides, I don't think I could care for a baby Kangaskhan well, let alone the average person. And as for the mother, a Kangaskhan gets very protective over its baby. Like, extremely Mama Ursa-ring about it. Anyone who doesn't know what they're doing can easily anger this Pokemon to a dangerous point. For your safety and for the baby Pokemon's health, you should never raise a baby Kangaskhan, even if you do have the mother. If you have a Kangaskhan and you accidentally get them pregnant, immediately contact a professional that can come in and either help to care for the baby while it stays with the mother, or send your Pokemon away to the professionals so that they can be cared for effectively. I know it sucks to have to send your Pokemon away to somewhere else for years, but it's the best course of action for everyone involved. Now, with all that explained and covered, let's get into the guide and figure out if this Pokemon can be the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Enclosure. Just like most of the Safari Zone Pokemon, the perfect enclosure for these guys are temperate grasslands. And so, really the best place for you to keep these Pokemon is in your yard. Now, that's not to say that anyone could keep these Pokemon in any old yard. For one, they need a lot of space. With how big they are and the fact that they do wander around quite a bit, you'll have to give them something that is at least 50 feet per side, but that is the smallest area they can live in if that's all you have. Really, the best space for them would be something more like 75 feet per side, giving them plenty of space to truly stretch their legs and move around. That's 15.25 meters and 22.86 meters for those of you that use them. When talking about what the fencing should be like for a Kangaskhan, you want to make sure that the fencing is at least 6 feet tall, 1.8 meters, so as to keep them from trying to get over it. One thing you have to keep in mind that many people don't think of with these Pokemon is the fact that they can dig, and will try to get under any fence area that they can. After all, these Pokemon are carnivorous, so you have to keep in mind that those claws are mainly there for self-defense and for digging in the ground. Hence, if they find a spot where your fencing doesn't meet or even goes into the ground, then they may start digging into it and end up either destabilizing the fencing or making a hole big enough for them to get out of their enclosure. To that end, the best option for you would probably be to use heavy gauge wire fencing that's rated for Pokemon like this, and have it buried about a foot into the ground on all sides, or 0.3 meters down. You'll also need to get a gate that you can use to get into the enclosure. Again, try to get the gate as close to the ground as you can. But since you still need the gate to be able to move, be sure to always check if your Pokemon is starting to dig under and undermine the gate. And always, make sure that the gate remains locked if you aren't in the enclosure. I've seen a few posts online that say how if these Pokemon get the chance to make a run for it, then they're going to, and leaving the gate unlocked is a good way to facilitate that. As for the rest of the enclosure, just like most of the other Pokemon that can be found in the various safari zones, these Pokemon do best in grasslands. However, unlike the Rhyhorn line or the others that I've talked about, it would be best if you have at least one tree in the enclosure with these Pokemon. Often these Pokemon prefer to relax in the middle of the day in a shady spot, and having a tree in their enclosure would give them a decent spot for them to relax without having to retreat into the indoor part of the enclosure. Spoiler alert, there will be an indoor section covered later on. One thing that you want to avoid when you have these Pokemon is that you want to avoid any long-term standing mud. If it's only there for a day or two after a rainstorm, then that's fine. But any longer than that, and it can easily become a breeding pit for harmful bacteria, as well as a slipping hazard for these Pokemon. Part of what these Pokemon do to keep themselves clean is that they groom themselves, and if they end up licking up some of that mud, it can end up making them pretty sick. As well, if you live somewhere that experiences cold winters, long-standing mud can freeze over and present even more of a slipping hazard to your Pokemon. Speaking of, despite the fact that these Pokemon live in temperate grasslands and are more well known for warmer climates, they do surprisingly well in the cold. They can tolerate temperatures down to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit or about 4 degrees Celsius. That's not to say that they should be left outside in those conditions, but you shouldn't have to worry about them during the day at least. If the weather reaches below those temperatures, then they will want to stay inside of the indoor enclosure for the majority of their day, only going outside occasionally. As for the indoor enclosure that I've been mentioning, it should be at least 30 feet on a side, non-meters, and it should be between 15 and 20 feet tall, 4.5 to 6 meters. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just make sure that the inside of the enclosure is warm or cool enough for the Pokemon. Something I found in my research is that these Pokemon actually like raised beds over ones that are on the ground. Something large enough for a fully grown Kangaskhan to lay down on, with it standing about a foot or so off the ground. I don't know why they like raised beds, but apparently they do. As well, you should spread some kind of bedding or substrate on the floor and the raised bed. Not only will this give the Pokemon a soft place to sleep, but it will also help with cleaning and waste cleanup. Add in a water bucket or something along those lines and your Kangaskhan should be right at home in here. The best Pokemon to house with these Pokemon are either others of their own kind, or small, kind Pokemon. The former is because they naturally form large groups in the wild, known as a court. Or they would, if they weren't so rare in the wild thanks to overhunting. But they get along very well with each other, and have been known to even care for each other's young when the need has arisen. As for the second option, the motherly instinct is so strong in these Pokemon that any small, non-aggressive Pokemon that they find, they will immediately try to care for them almost as if they're their own kid. Especially baby Pokemon, though, as I've said before in these guides, you shouldn't really own a baby Pokemon unless you're specifically raising one in a rescue situation, and it's often much better to raise them among their own kind. What you want to avoid are any Pokemon that are large and or aggressive, as your Kangaskhan will definitely not put up with that. I should make mention that a few of the less aggressive canine species of Pokemon, like the Growlithe or the Yamper line, can be kept with a Kangaskhan, but both Pokemon would have to be raised around each other to get them comfortable with that idea. If you just throw them together, then that might cause a real problem. Availability. Unfortunately, quite some time ago, these Pokemon were hunted extensively, to the point where the population and the future of the species was placed into question. A lot of their wild populations were decimated, and as such, they either can't be found outside of man-made or protected areas, such as the Safari Zone in Johto, the Great Marsh in Sinnoh, and the Wele Volcano Park in Alola, or they can only be found in caves, such as Rock Tunnel in Johto, Glittering Cave in Kalos, and the Warm-Up Tunnel in Galar. In case you can't tell from how different those places are from the enclosure that I've described, they aren't exactly optimal environments for these Pokemon. The only place that these Pokemon live which is somewhat decent for them is Route 15 in Unova. I'm assuming they were introduced to the area by someone, because even though it's the best place you can find a Kangaskhan, all of the cliffs are not great for them. Better than caves, but that's not by much. And even if you do make it to these areas, they also aren't a common Pokemon to find. Due to the fact that the young need to develop for so long and the mothers spend 3 years raising them, it's very common for mature Kangaskhan to only reproduce every 3 years, meaning their populations grow very slowly. Combine that with the suboptimal living conditions for a lot of the wild population, and the fact that there aren't any males of the species, so they have to find compatible males from other species to reproduce, and you're going to have a rather hard time finding one to catch. Which brings us to the breeding scene for these Pokemon. It's honestly not the worst, but not the best either. A lot of that has to do with their slow reproduction rate. Usually, with Pokemon that lay eggs, which is most of them, you either get more than one per clutch, like you do with reptile, avian, and some mammalian Pokemon, or you get one egg a clutch, but they grow fast and the mother is able to lay again in a relatively short period of time. The fact that Kangaskhan not only give live birth, but also have to raise their young for the first 3 years of its life, means that producing these Pokemon on mass scale would require a massive operation, one that really only governments have the resources to achieve. And right now, those are mainly focused on breeding the wild population back up to a reasonable and sustainable level. If you're looking for a private breeder that you can get a Kangaskhan from, then you can probably find one, but it's gonna definitely be very expensive, and you're probably gonna have to be on a wait list while a young one is raised up and trained. But, as we're about to get into, this might legally be your only option. Catchability. I've kinda been burying the lead here, but when it comes to catching a wild Kangaskhan, there are actually one of the few Pokemon that are illegal to catch outside of the game reserves. This is because of a couple factors. Catching a wild Kangaskhan would then remove that individual from the wild population. This, of course, reduces the number of Kangaskhan that are out there able to sustain that population, but also you have to keep in mind that you might be catching a Pokemon that is away from its baby. Unlikely as it is, it has been known to happen, and the Pokemon goes wild and becomes a danger to the trainer as a result, not to mention that the baby can't care for itself without the mother. And so, simply going out to catch one of these Pokemon is considered poaching of an endangered species, and will earn you not only fines, but confiscation of the Pokemon in question, and if you've been neglecting them or mistreating them while they're under your care, you might also be facing jail time as well. The only places where you're able to legally catch one of these Pokemon are the game reserves like the Safari Zone and the Great Marsh. These are individuals who have already had and raised a few children already, and having any further babies would start to have a detrimental effect on the Pokemon's body. So they're placed out in the game reserve to enjoy the wildlife, or to give people who want a Kangaskhan of their own a chance at caring for one. Fair warning though, if you do manage to catch a Kangaskhan in these places, you're going to be subject to far stricter background checks and inspections before you're even allowed to go home with the Pokemon. They want to make sure that the Kangaskhan is going to be going to a good home after all. Only after you pass all of those will you then be able to take home your Kangaskhan. Care. After all that, the actual care for these Pokemon is fairly straightforward. Of course, there's the cleaning you'll have to do, the normal stuff of cleaning up the waste and changing out the bedding on the inside of the enclosure, but there's also how you have to keep an eye on how wet the enclosure is getting, like I mentioned in the enclosure section. Food is also a fairly straightforward thing to deal with. Being obligate herbivores, they'll require a good quality hay to munch on as well as other fruits and veggies. Apples and carrots are probably the best thing you can give them in this regard. Thankfully, Kangaskhan aren't known to gorge or stuff themselves with whatever food they can find, so you can really leave the hay bale in the enclosure with them and they'll eat and munch on it as time goes on. Whenever you see that the hay is getting low or has been sitting there for too long and is getting gross, change it out with newer stuff. Then the supplements, fruits, and veggies can be given them once a day, about 3 pounds of it. This should provide all of the nutritional value that your Kangaskhan needs, but that isn't all they need. In the wild, these Pokemon will sometimes chew on tough or woody brush that they find. This is to help their teeth stay strong and clean through chewing on the tougher stuff. Just planting some brush in their enclosure to provide some shoots for the Pokemon to chew on should be enough to satisfy this need. Then, whenever you notice that they're running low on those, plant some more or just give them some more. Like I said, it's all simple stuff, but really necessary to keep these Pokemon healthy and happy. As I've talked about through this entire guide, by the time you get your Kangaskhan, it should be one of the older ones that's from one of the nature reserves. Meaning that you shouldn't have to do any exposure training for behavior work with them. They should be used to humans, and the most you'll have to do is let them get used to the new environment and get used to you specifically. But as long as you got one of the nature reserve Pokemon, that should only take a few days or so. You also shouldn't be in possession of a baby Kangaskhan at all. I won't rehash the details again, but needless to say that the average person doesn't have what it takes to care for a baby Kangaskhan effectively. No, what this small bit is going to be about is preparing you for the motherly instincts of your Kangaskhan kicking in over any of your other Pokemon. It's a well-known thing that a Kangaskhan will become motherly and protective of other Pokemon they come across. For this to happen, the Pokemon must be small, about the size of a small bug Pokemon or the average baby Pokemon, and the Pokemon must be non-temperamental, allowing the Kangaskhan to get close to them without trying to fight or attack the Kangaskhan too much. If this happens, you need to be careful around your Kangaskhan. Those protective motherly instincts might kick in over this adopted baby, and those instincts can be vicious. Normally when this happens, they aren't as protective of the adoptive baby as they would be of a baby they had on their own, and they hopefully have been around humans enough at this point to trust you around their child, so overall this shouldn't be too much of a problem for you to deal with. You might just need to keep an extra eye on your Kangaskhan when around the adopted Pokemon, and be extra strict with the discipline to keep them from getting irritable. But there have been cases where the Kangaskhan becomes overly protective of the adopted Pokemon and become highly territorial and protective towards anything they might think to be a threat of their new child. If this happens, you need to find and contact a professional who can come in and deal with the situation. It might be a simple fix of removing the adopted Pokemon from the situation, or things might escalate to the point where your Kangaskhan might need to be sent away for special training and care. Those motherly instincts, while great for caring for the babies of the species, can really end up causing problems down the line for you and the Pokemon. Cost. The enclosure is going to cost you a decent amount of money. Fencing is not cheap to put in, even if you decide to do it yourself, and the indoor enclosure is going to be a pretty penny on its own. Thankfully, as long as you don't have to fix the drainage of the area, you don't have to do any special landscaping, helping to save a bit of money in that area. Unfortunately, even with that lucky break, you're still going to end up spending somewhere in the high or the very high range. These Pokemon are going to either be really expensive or somewhat expensive. If you get the Pokemon from a breeder, then you're not only going to have to pay in the very high category thanks to the effort and time needed to raise a viable population of these Pokemon, but you'll also have to most likely be put on a wait list for when an appropriate individual ages out of the breeding program. On the other hand, it can be in the moderate to the high category for the price of admission to one of the managed areas. But in that case, it's much more of a risk that you won't get a Kangaskhan at all. Sure, you might have to wait and pay more if you get one through a breeder, but it's much more of a guaranteed thing that way. Food is where you might be able to catch a break with these guys. Hay is very cheap, as is getting the brush and twigs for them to chew on. And then, for the fruits and veggies, I don't see all of this costing you more than the moderate amount per month. Possibly even less than that if you're able to buy them in bulk and keep them from going bad too quickly. Conclusion. It's really a shame that these Pokemon are so hard to get a hold of, because they would honestly make decent pet Pokemon for those who have the space to keep them. Very easy care, no special food requirements or handling needs, and the enclosure, while needing a lot of space, is simple when you compare it to some of the others that we've gone over in this series. They would be good for anyone who wants something a bit more complex than a beginner level Pokemon, but not quite at the level where you should have some experience to be able to take care of these Pokemon. But, thanks to that low population count and the slow pace that they increase their numbers, it's just not feasible for the average person. Trying to get one requires a lot of luck, a lot of time, and a decent amount of money. Not to mention the possible issues with those motherly instincts kicking in. But if none of those factors is a deal breaker for you, then it might be that a Kangaskhan is the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we go over the small seahorse Pokemon Horsey and its two evolutions, Seadra and Kingdra. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Oceanic Pokemon are always going to be tricky. There are the ones that are so big that they aren't able to be kept outside of tanks the size of sports fields, if not larger, which no regular person is going to have any chance of having. Or their habitat and diet requirements are so specific and difficult to reach and maintain in a tank that it's unreasonable for the average person to be expected to keep them. And then there are those that are so strong that to keep them in anything less than a highly regulated and monitored enclosure means risking disaster. And unfortunately, I feel like we might be running into all three of those restrictions with this line. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and keep different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the very unique looking Pokemon Horsea and its evolutions Seadra and Kingdra. Horsea is a very different looking water Pokemon when you compare it to the rest of the aquatic world. This Pokemon's body stands upright, almost like we do, with a large curled tail at the bottom of its body and a small butterfly-like fin on its back that it uses for swimming. The belly is also covered in cream-colored ridges. Its head is round, with two sets of blue spiked fins on either side of its face and a long tube-like mouth. To cap it off, it has large eyes that have red irises. In total, it looks very much like a soft and friendly Pokemon. Horsea is also relatively small, only being about 1 foot 4 inches on average, or 0.4 meters, and only weighing about 17.5 pounds, that being 8 kilograms. This all changes though when the Pokemon evolves into a Seadra. A lot of the Pokemon scales go from smooth and round to sharp and spiky. The tail gets a lot longer, though it's still curled up under the Pokemon. Instead of the one single butterfly fin on its back, it has been replaced with two larger spiked fins that the Pokemon can use to pretty effectively push its way through the water. Then, its head is topped with sharp crests. Seadra is also much bigger than its previous evolution, standing nearly 4 feet tall and around 55 pounds. Or that's 1.2 meters and 25 kilos. And for the longest time, that's where the evolutionary line was thought to end. But with the advent of the trading machine and the discovery of the item known as a dragon scale, it was discovered that Seadra could evolve once again into the very powerful Kingdra. Kingdra is another massive increase in size when compared to its previous forms, now being nearly 6 feet tall on average, 1.8 meters, and weighing an impressive 335 pounds or 152 kilos. Kingdra keeps the same general body shape as the others in its evolutionary line, but trades a lot of Seadra's sharp edges for flowing lines. Its snout is now much more streamlined and powerful, and now has what almost seem like antlers and coral branches coming from the top of its head. As well, the spiked fins that Seadra had has now gone back down to a single fin, made of a thin white membrane and supported by more antler coral-like branches. In reality, these are not too complex of a Pokemon line, but we all know by now that caring for water-type Pokemon, especially the fully aquatic ones, can get pretty tough and have a lot of factors to keep an eye on. If that's not a deterrent to you, well, let's get into the guide and figure out if these Pokemon could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. So, there's two special things that you have to think about when it comes to these Pokemon. One is that they are very social, to the point where you should have at least 2 of these Pokemon in your enclosure, or they might start experiencing things like depression, anxiety, and loneliness. This holds true for at least Horsea and Seadra. Kingdra, like we'll cover in the care section of this guide, has extenuating circumstances that mean they aren't as social as their pre-evolutions. But for the first 2 forms, they will need at least another of their own kind in there with them. To that end, I'll make sure that the enclosure dimensions that I give you are at least big enough to handle 2 of these Pokemon. And if you want to add more to your... what is a group of these Pokemon called? Hold on, everyone. A shoal. Huh. That's actually a pretty cool name. But if you want to increase the size of your shoal, then you'll have to expand the tank beyond that. Also, I feel I should mention this to you, if you get opposite sex members of this species, meaning a male and female, they're most likely going to reproduce. If you don't want that, then be sure to get 2 Pokemon of the same sex. The second major issue that you're going to encounter with these Pokemon, as you will with most oceanic Pokemon, is going to be the enclosure size. Oh, sure, Horsey is going to be a reasonable sized tank, but it's also the smallest of the group. For a pair of Horsey, you'll want something that is at least 55 gallons in volume, though larger is never a bad thing for these Pokemon. You want to make sure that the tank is on the taller size, with the height of the tank being at least twice the height of the Pokemon, giving them plenty of space to swim and move around. Then, for each Horsey that you add above the initial 2, you should add in another 10 gallons to the enclosure. That's honestly a fairly reasonable sized enclosure. You could easily have this tank set up on a table in your home and could easily take care of them with little issue. It's once we start working our way up the evolutionary chain that things get more unmanageable. When your Pokemon evolve into a Seadra, not only are they now 3 times the size of your Horsey, but Seadra are also a lot more energetic than Horsey. With the larger fins and the fact that they now have 2 of them as opposed to 1, they can swim and move much faster and with more force than any Horsey ever can. All this means that you're looking at a tank that measures into thousands of gallons, easily the size of your average above-ground pool. There's really no way that you're going to be able to just buy these from your local pet store like you could with the Horsey's enclosure. As well, it needs to be at least 10 feet deep to accommodate your Seadras, which is actually deeper than most above-ground pools you can get. That's gonna have to be a custom build no matter what you do. And then we get to Kingdra. Kingdra is actually the first Dragon-type Pokemon that we're covering in this show, and as we go on, you'll see a trend with Dragon-type Pokemon is that they are exceedingly powerful creatures. There's a reason that the majority of super strong Pokemon that people place in the unofficial pseudo-legendary category are Dragon types, and even the ones that avoid this label are well known to be on the stronger end. That kind of power can often lead to some quirks in their care and enclosure. For Kingdra, it means that they not only need a lot of space in their tanks, they also need a tank that is much deeper than either of their pre-evolutions. I'm talking about a tank that, and this is the minimum size, mind you, is at least the length and width of a Unovan football field, and it has to have a depth exceeding 35 feet deep. That's about 110 meters long, 49 meters wide, and 11 meters deep for the majority of the world that has no concept of how big a Unovan football field is. I don't know about you, but to me, that is an insane size for an enclosure. All because this Pokemon is so powerful that if you try to house it in anything smaller than that, it's most likely gonna break the enclosure on top of not being happy or healthy. And to top it all off, the enclosure needs to be able to handle things like whirlpools, water spouts, and strong currents. Again, thanks to how strong these Pokemon are. Right away, I'm going to tell you that this is the kind of enclosure that needs to be specifically built to exacting specifications by professional companies and will need to be inspected at a few different stages of the construction. It is a massive undertaking, and is the main reason that the only times you see professional trainers with these kind of Pokemon on their teams are gym leaders and Pokemon League members. They're really the only ones that have the resources to house these Pokemon outside of a Pokeball. It's not only the enclosure that takes a lot of setup, you also have to keep an eye on the conditions of the water. Things like temperature, salinity, pH balance, and the lighting are all things that you're going to have to deal with when caring for these Pokemon. The temperature is actually the easiest to handle. As their availability locations will show later on, these Pokemon can live in locations that have wildly varying water temps, from the colder waters of Kanto and Sinnoh to the warmer waters of Alola and Hoenn. Really, the main things that you have to keep an eye on are the pH and the salinity. For the pH, it needs to be around 8.1 to 8.4, which is a bit more on the basic side of the scale, and the salinity has to be around 28 to 32 parts per thousand. Or, if the test you're using uses the specific gravity of the water, then you'll be aiming for between 1.021 and 1.025. I know, that's a lot of chemistry and science stuff that I just threw at you, but if you're looking at getting some of these Pokemon, then you'll need to learn about them. Aside from all that, you need to make sure that the enclosures have a few things. Of course, with this being an oceanic line, you'll need to make sure that you fill the tank with salt water. Make sure that you get all the equipment that is rated to handle the salt that's going to be flowing through it. Always remember, salt eats away at anything it comes into contact with, especially metal. For all of these Pokemon, a decent current is needed for them as well. This helps with circulating fresh, oxygenated water to these Pokemon and around the tank. A current like that can be gotten if you have a decent, strong filter on the tank, which will also help with keeping the waters clean. Of course, as the tank gets bigger, the filter and current systems are going to get increasingly more complex. For Horsey, you'll probably just need a small motor, like the regular ones that you can get for most indoor fish tanks. Seadra might need a couple of motors, or just one big one that can handle that level of water. And of course, for Kingdra, it's going to be an entire complex system of motors that can keep that much water moving. Mind, you have to be careful that you don't make the current too strong in the Horsey enclosure. Seadra and Kingdra won't be too affected by this since they're fairly strong swimmers, but Horsey is actually a weak swimmer and can be pushed around if the current is too strong. On top of that, you should have some decorations in the tank with your Pokemon. I would recommend a small layer of sand, about 1.5 inches worth, with things like rocks, coral branches, and plants all set into it. This is important as these Pokemon sleep by wrapping their tails around those things to anchor them to the bottom of the seafloor, or in this case the bottom of the tank. Especially Kingdra, who won't just need some rocks or coral, they'll actually need a spot where they can feel secluded from the rest of the tank for their hibernation. To that end, you'll also have to have a cave installed on the bed of your tank where your Kingdra can enter to sleep without having too much interruptions to their natural rhythm. It's not much when you compare it to the rest of the tank, but it's all very important to these Pokemon. As for Pokemon that can be housed with your Horsey evolution, of course you're going to be limited by a few factors. One is that this line is carnivorous, and they will eat anything that they can catch and fit into their mouths. That includes small fish, crustaceans that they're able to crack the shell on, and the occasional shellfish. On top of that, each of the lines has a special factor that makes keeping anything else with them complicated. Horsey are not great swimmers, as I've said, and are generally very timid Pokemon, so if you put them with anything too aggressive in an enclosure, then you're asking for your Horsey to be hurt. Seadra, while being more able to defend itself from threats, does so through the use of toxins that it puts out through the spines on its body. Any Pokemon that you put with them, other than other Horsey evolutions, might end up needing a run to the Pokemon Center due to toxins. Kingdra might seem like the best bet to house other Pokemon with at first glance. It has a massive tank, and the Kingdra itself spends the majority of its time hibernating in the cave at the bottom of its tank. But when your Kingdra does wake up, not only is it then going to go on a hunting spree trying to fill its belly for the next hibernation cycle, it's also going to disturb the entire environment of the enclosure just through waking up, thanks to the strong whirlpools and water spouts that are going to start happening from your Kingdra releasing its stored up energy. That is a serious risk to any Pokemon that you have in the tank with them, meaning that it's really best to leave it in the tank alone. Same, honestly, with the rest of the evolutionary line, but let me remind you that Horsey and Seadra both need at least one other of their own kind around, as the first two stages of the line are very social. You should be ready to accommodate that need and possibly get a bigger enclosure if you plan to go over the two individual limits that I've covered here in this guide. Availability. The nice part about this line is that they are very easy to find in the wild. Horsey and Cedra are super abundant. They're available in most of the ocean-facing routes in Kanto, the southern routes surrounding Pacific Town and Hoenn, routes 17 and 18 in southern Unova. Even in the regions where they aren't super abundant, there are still places where they can be found with very little effort. They like to make their homes in the Whirl Islands in Choto and near Stark Mountain in Sinnoh, along Route 226, the Insular Sea in Galar along the Isle of Armor, Kalae Bay in Alola, and then Ambret Town and Silage City in Kalos. It's honestly amazing that they haven't spread farther than those spots, but it might be a matter of shallower waters versus deeper waters. Speaking of which, due to Kingdra being classified as a trade evolution, it's very rare for them to show up in the wild. You would need a Cedra to be near an item known as a dragon scale, and then receive an electric shock of very specific voltage to trigger the evolution. As I'm sure you can imagine, that's not exactly something that happens every day. On top of that scarcity, Kingdra spend the majority of their time hibernating at the bottom of the ocean, conserving and building their energy for the brief periods of activity when they're awake. Being on the bottom of the ocean and non-responsive to most stimuli means that finding them like that is astoundingly difficult. And then, when they do wake up, they trigger storms, bad waves, and powerful currents, meaning that finding them might become easier, but it also becomes way more dangerous, which is probably worse. All that being said, finding a wild Kingdra is going to be an exercise in frustration, patience, and defying death. Which I'm sure means that you're hoping that they're more available in the breeding industry. I hate to burst your bubble on that, but no, they aren't. Having to build such a big enclosure for just one Kingdra is a massive undertaking and investment. Not to mention that there is next to no market for selling that Pokemon to casual trainers. Having to make an enclosure that's large enough for more than one of them, well, let's just say that whatever breeder decides they're going to invest in a Kingdra breeding program has way too much money, space, and time on their hands. Thankfully, the market for the previous two evolutions is much better. Setting up a breeding facility for Horsies is relatively easy thanks to how manageable their enclosure is, as well as how social they can be. The same goes for Cedra, though they'll be a bit harder to get a hold of simply due to the fact that their size and the fact that they're slightly venomous. If you want one of the first two evolutions, then it shouldn't be too hard for you to find a breeder that's selling them, and if you decide you really want a Kingdra, then you can probably get the breeder to help you evolve a Cedra when you buy them. Just be sure to remember that you'll be paying more for that service because the breeder will have to get the dragon scale for the Cedra to hold on to during the trade. Catchability. As with most Pokemon that you have to either fish up or randomly encounter on the open sea, the biggest thing that you'll need to encounter these Pokemon is patience and a way to defend yourself. Thankfully, Horsey and, to a lesser extent, Cedra aren't the most difficult Pokemon to try and fish for. They're abundant enough in the areas they live in that if you use the correct kind of bait and a decent rod, you shouldn't have to cast out more than a handful of times to hook one of these Pokemon. Just remember that you aren't guaranteed to bring up what you're looking for from the depths, and you had better be able and willing to defend yourself from any and all kinds of Pokemon that might appear. Always research what types of Pokemon are present in the area you're hunting in, and prepare accordingly. As for dealing with a Horsey evolution, your best bets are having either an electric or grass-type Pokemon on hand. Kingdra, as ever, is a much different beast. Not only is it very rare to encounter a Kingdra in the wild, you also have to hope that it's even awake at the time that you're hunting for it. And if it is awake, then you're looking at dealing with all kinds of massive environmental issues. Storms, massive waves, whirlpools, water spouts, strong currents. Being out there in that is going to feel like the end of the world and is my personal nightmare scenario. I really cannot stress how not worth it is to try and go out and catch one of these Pokemon. You're going to be putting yourself in major danger. But I have to say that it is at least possible. You'll need a massive ship that can handle that kind of rough sailing, along with a crew that's very experienced in dealing with bad weather conditions, as well as the strongest defense Pokemon that you can get your hands on, but it is technically possible. As for what you should be using to catch each Pokemon, a Pokeball or Great Ball should be fine for Horsey, a Great Ball should be good for Seadra, and certainly use an Ultra Ball for Kingdra if you even get the chance to throw one at them. Care. After all that, the care for these Pokemon really comes down to two different things that you have to do: feeding and cleaning. Let's start with the latter. As with any enclosure that has water as a major part of the enclosure, there are a lot of factors you'll have to keep an eye on. You should check the temperatures every day, as that's one of the factors that can change the most rapidly. The other factors, like the pH and the salinity levels, should be checked at least weekly, more if they've been out of balance recently. The tests to check them should be easily accessible online and come with instructions on how to properly use them. You'll also have to do frequent water changes for the enclosure. This not only will help to keep the majority of the water clean in the enclosure, but it will also make it much easier for you to maintain the needed levels for the enclosure water. If there is nothing wrong with the water, like you haven't noticed any of the levels are out of whack, then you should be replacing about 20% of the water every 3 to 4 weeks. If you have noticed a problem with either the salinity or the pH, then you should start to change the water out more frequently, about every week and a half as long as the issue isn't major. This slow change out of water will not only keep your Pokemon from possibly going into shock from being rapidly introduced to new levels in the water, but it also helps to keep some of the more healthy bacteria that could develop in your Horsey's evolution's environment. Of course, this changing out of water is going to be much harder to handle for the large evolutions than it's going to be for a Horsey, but it's still a necessary part of their care. Speaking of, there's also the needed cleaning that you'll have to do of the glass and the filter systems. Over time, they are going to get gross, just due to the nature of always being submerged in water and dealing with the salt. And as I said with the water, the effort needed for this is going to massively change based on what evolution you have. For example, the glass in the Horsey and Seadra enclosures can be cleaned with one of those magnetic scrubbers that you can get stuck on the edge of the tank, and the filters can just be pulled out of the filter systems and cleaned that way. Or, if you don't like how long and physically intensive scrubbing the walls of your Seadra's enclosure is going to be, you can also try to get one of those scrubbing vacuums that people get for the walls of their pools. In my personal opinion, your best bet for getting this done is to either hire someone or get suited up yourself in diving gear and use the scrubbing vacuum on the walls. You can always put your Seadra into their Pokeballs if you don't feel comfortable swimming around with them, which I don't blame you for since their spines are venomous. And as for the large and complex water filter and current system that you have to get for your Kingdra, you're probably going to have someone come out and clean it for you. I can't imagine that something that large and complex is going to have a simple filter that you can just pull out and hose off. Always remember that you want to use Pokemon-safe chemicals when you clean the tank, especially as whatever you use will be released into the surrounding water and will easily come into contact with your Pokemon. Feeding is a somewhat easier and less complex affair than cleaning is. This line is carnivorous, often feeding on small crustaceans and fish. To that end, you have a few options when it comes to how you feed these Pokemon. One is that you can just release the food into the water of the enclosure. This is the easiest method, very much a throw and walk away method, but the issues kind of outweigh the convenience of it. If your Pokemon doesn't eat up every bit of food you throw in, then it can end up starting to decay and rot at the bottom or the top of the tank, which is going to start making the water gross and, if left for too long, can also lead to disease taking hold in the tank. You'll have to get into the tank to remove the food that doesn't get eaten. Lastly, it's also just a waste of money for food to go bad. On the other end of the spectrum, you could try hand feeding. This is really good if you end up getting one of the picky eaters that doesn't like to eat anything but live food. By putting the food in your hand, it allows you to move it around through the water, giving the illusion that it's still alive and kicking. It might not work, and if you can't get them to eat from your hand after about 15 minutes, then you'll have to go to live food, which I know plenty of you don't feel comfortable with. Also, hand feeding is really only something you can do with Horsey. Seadra, well, they wouldn't hurt you on purpose if they're used to you, but with their venomous spines, it's a real possibility that they may just accidentally graze you with one, and then you have to take an emergency trip to the hospital. Kingdra, though, when you feed them, it's a much more hazardous endeavor. With the thrashing waters, the power this Pokemon has, and the fact that they wake up ravenous, it's very dangerous to be sticking your whole hand in to reach of this Pokemon's mouth. The only saving grace in that situation is that they don't have teeth, but it's still gonna suck. Now, if you aren't dealing with one of the picky eaters, then the best thing you can do is to get a feeding station. These are small boxes that can be attached to the side of your enclosure where you can place the food and then your Pokemon can swim up and either enter the station to get the food, or they can stick their head in to eat what you give them. To me, this seems like the best option, as it keeps the food in one spot so you don't have to clean the entire tank just to get that one piece of food your Pokemon didn't eat, and it'll teach your Pokemon to always expect food to come from the same spot every time. Consistency is always a good thing when you're trying to establish a Pokemon in captivity. And these can work for all three of the evolutions. You'll just have to get larger ones for the later evolutions so that they can get to the food inside. When it comes to the amount of food that these Pokemon should be getting, you'll be feeding the first two evolutions 3 times a day with smaller meals. Due to the tube shape of their mouth, you'll have to feed them things that fit inside that tube, either from Pokemon that are naturally shaped like that, such as Tatsugiri, Wishiwashi, or the main bodies of Clauncher and Corphish, or taking the meat and cutting them into strips, at which point you can really use the meat of any prey-sea Pokemon. Exact numbers for these Pokemon are hard to narrow down, but it seems that the average Horsey will eat about 1.5 pounds of food a day, and a Seadra will eat about 3 pounds of food a day. Like I said, split between 3 meals over the course of a day. But when it comes to Kingdra, things change drastically. As I've said multiple times over the course of this guide, Kingdra enter extended periods of hibernation. This is due to their new draconic nature. Over time, as they sleep, they build up their power until it reaches a crescendo, at which point they awaken and go on a flurry of activity, spending all of this power until they eventually need to re-enter hibernation and start the cycle over again. This release of strong, draconic power is what causes all the storms and environmental issues when a Kingdra is active. Normally, these hibernation cycles can last anywhere from 1 to 3 months, followed by an awake period of 4 to 7 days. And, as I'm sure you can imagine, it also plays into their eating schedule. Of course, these Pokemon won't be eating anything while they're hibernating, so that actually makes the majority of their care much easier than most Pokemon. But you should regularly keep an eye on the enclosure so that you can be ready to start feeding when you see that your Pokemon is going to be waking up soon. You'll begin seeing things like small whirls appearing in the water, stronger currents showing up than what your filter system should be producing, and, rarely, there can also be a slight glowing coming from where your Pokemon is resting. When all of that begins, it means that you have to start getting ready to do a lot of feeding. An awake and active Kingdra is going to eat an astonishing 6 pounds of food a day, still divided between 3 meals over the course of the day. The feeding station should still be effective so long as you train them on that from before they were a Kingdra. Otherwise, you'll just have to use the free feeding method. Hand feeding a Kingdra, like I said, is not a good idea. Just something to keep an eye on when you feed Kingdra. If your Kingdra is already awake, then the water is going to be turbulent and probably moving quickly. Be careful when you put the food into the feeding station, or you could easily fall into the water and then you have to deal with a very dangerous situation. Cost. I'm gonna level with you. Most, if not all of the things in this guide are going to be on a sliding scale from cheap to really expensive based on what evolution you decide to have. For example, when we talk about how expensive the Pokemon itself is going to be, Horsey isn't going to be that much thanks to its ease of raising and the simplicity of its enclosure, probably maxing out in the low category. Seadra will be a bit of a jump up to the moderate or possibly the lower end of the high category. And Kingdra, because of the ridiculous size of its enclosure and the item needed to have one, is certainly going to be in the very high category if you can even find someone who sells Kingdra as opposed to stopping at Seadra. Same pattern with the enclosures. Horsey's is so small that you can probably get most of the stuff for their tank from your average pet store, which means that it won't go above the low category. Seadra, you're going to have to order them online from a specific supplier or have them custom built, bringing it to the high category. And then, following suit, the massive tank that you'll need for Kingdra is going to be very, very far into the very high category. Food is the one spot where this pattern doesn't hold purely because of Kingdra's hibernation. Horsey and Seadra are going to be in the moderate and the high category respectively. Seafood is often expensive to get a hold of after all, but thanks to the fact that you won't have to feed Kingdra anything for 1 to 3 months, actually brings the price down from what it could have been, even if it's still in the high category thanks to how much they eat in that short amount of time they're awake. The nice part is that you can freeze the food so that you have it on hand when you need it. Just be sure to fully thaw it out when you go to feed it to your Pokemon. Conclusion. Whew. That definitely feels like my longest guide so far. I knew dragon types would make things more complex, but I don't think there's been a Pokemon line that has varied so wildly with how good of a pet Pokemon they would make as this line does. Realistically, Horsey is a great beginner Pokemon for those out there that want to have a saltwater aquatic Pokemon. It's got a decent sized enclosure, you can interact with them by hand feeding, something that you can't say for a lot of aquatic Pokemon, and they're friendly and cute. And then, when they evolve into a Seadra, they get a bit more complicated with the larger fins and the venomous spines. Definitely something that should be considered an intermediate level Pokemon. And then there's Kingdra. I really can't see this being something that can be kept outside of an aquarium. Unless you have a metric ton of money, that is, because just the tank itself is going to be a major project to get completed. Not to mention that it can be dangerous just to feed this Pokemon when they're awake due to what they do to the water. So when talking about this line, it really matters which form you're talking about when you consider if these Pokemon would be the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the vibrantly colored Pokemon Goldeen and its evolution Seaking. Have a wonderful night, everyone. As anyone who has been listening to this series knows by now, I'm not a fan of deep water. It's usually in response to the ocean, and thinking of the deep, dark, cold spaces where there are things that we don't know about and that have never known the warmth of Arceus' light. But I'm also not that big a fan of freshwater spaces as well. After all, there can just as easily be dangers in them as there can be in the oceans, as the Lake of Rage in Johto shows. But, to finally get to the point that I've been circling, while I'm not a big fan of the water and the Pokemon found there, a lot of people find aquatic Pokemon to be beautiful and amazing to watch. And one of the ones that's always at the top of that list are these Pokemon. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through different Pokemon species and how you can raise them in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the flowing beauty of the water, Goldeen, and its evolution Seaking. Goldeen is a relatively small aquatic Pokemon, only measuring 2 feet, 0.6 meters, and weighing about 33 pounds, or 15 kilos. Their bodies are predominantly white, with orange markings along the upper side of their body and fins. Their central body is very ovoid in shape, with 2 large eyes and large lips. Their horn is situated in the center of their forehead, and then their fins are what they are known for, looking very much like flowing, dress-like material. These fins are what really draw people to these Pokemon, as many people think that they're beautiful when they swim through the water. Later on, a Goldeen will evolve into a Seaking. Seaking is a much larger fish than its previous evolution, now being over 4 feet long and weighing over 86 pounds usually. That's 1.3 meters and 39 kilos. Seaking keeps the same general body plan that Goldeen does, but its main body is now much rounder and loses a lot of the white coloration, now being a predominantly orange color. The long flowiness of the fins is still present, including the tail fins, which have changed to almost look like butterfree wings colored white with black flecks on them. As well, Seaking keeps the large eyes, lips, and horn of its previous evolution. Overall, I know my descriptions haven't done these Pokemon justice, and there are very large fan bases for both of them that will defend how beautiful these Pokemon are when they swim. If having a Pokemon like that sounds interesting to you, then please listen in and you might find that these Pokemon are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. As I said in the intro, these Pokemon are a freshwater species, so you won't have to deal with the major hassle that saltwater can easily become. Though, as you'll soon see, the best setup for them would be a pond or small lake over an actual aquarium. Of course, there are their horns to think about. These Pokemon are very well known for ramming things with their horns, and they have even had a reputation for shattering glass enclosures that people have put them in. If you try to put them in that kind of enclosure, then you had better make sure that it's rated to handle that kind of impact and force. But the bigger reason that it'd be better for you to have these Pokemon in a pond is the immense size of the enclosure that you need. A Goldeen, a single Goldeen, needs a space that consists of at least 1,000 gallons of water. It's immense, and if you try to get something like that in an aquarium, you're going to be spending quite a bit of money getting it set up. Now, that's not something we've shied away from in this series before. Just last guide, I had you building a tank the size of a Unovan football field for Kingdra. But thanks to these Pokemon being freshwater Pokemon, you can build them a pond and then not have to deal with the glass. As for the dimensions of the pond, so long as it reaches the 1,000-gallon limit, then you can realistically build whatever you want, whether that be a rectangle, circle, or any other shape that you can think of. The only thing that the majority of the pond has to have is a depth of at least 4 feet. You can go deeper than that, absolutely, and I'm sure that your Pokemon would appreciate that, but the minimum depth for most of the pond needs to be at least 4 feet. This is a precaution for if you live in a place that gets cold during the winter. The top few feet of the water will freeze, and your Pokemon will go to the bottom of the pond and enter a dormant period until the water heats back up. We can get more into that in the care section, but you have to be sure to give them that room, or they'll freeze during the winter, and you'll have to get a new Pokemon. Remember, all of those dimensions that I gave you are just for a Goldeen. Seaking is much bigger than its previous evolution, and therefore needs more space. For them, you'll have to increase the size of the pond to around 1,500 gallons, with the water reaching a depth of at least 6 feet in the majority of the pond. It might not sound like too much of a difference, but thanks to the fact that fish can use the entire space of their enclosure, not just the ground floor, it actually provides a lot more space for your Pokemon. Before we move on to talk about the water itself, which, don't get me wrong, is an important part of the enclosure, there are a few other details about the construction of the pond that I'd like to talk about. First is that you don't want the bottom of the pond to be just dirt. This can lead to things like bad bacteria, bugs, and other pest Pokemon getting into the water. It will also prevent the water from leaching out of the pond and in the surrounding ground. Getting a Pokemon-safe liner for the bottom of the pond will help to prevent that, and then, once the liner is settled and in place, you can add a small layer of substrate onto the bottom of the pond. The best ones to have are a layer of sand or dirt topped with a layer of gravel or smooth pebbles. You'll only need about an inch of it in total. Filtration is also a major thing you'll have to think about, and the cool thing is that you're not going to be using your basic mechanical filter. I mean, yes, that is going to be part of it. You want to make sure that you get a filter that is going to be able to filter at a rate of at least half the volume of the pond per hour. So, if you have a Goldeen pond with the minimum 1,000 gallons, then you need a filter that can filter up to 500 gallons per hour. I'm saying the word filter so much it doesn't sound like a real word to me anymore. Be sure that your filter can handle anything from algae that might be growing in the water to chemicals that can be in the water, such as the high amounts of ammonia that these Pokemon produce in their waste. You can also introduce a small amount of beneficial bacteria to the filter system, which will help to deal with things like the waste and other chemicals from the Pokemon, turning it into a nutritional fertilizer. Which brings me to the other part of the filtration that you can have. Having plants planted along the bottom of the pond can provide not only slight filtration for your water, it can also help to re-oxygenate the water, break down and clean up waste, and provide a multitude of other benefits to your Pokemon. These plants are the reason that I say you want the majority of your pond to be the appropriate depth. For many aquatic plants, they do best when at shallower depths, often between 1 to 2 feet in depth. Having them grow in these shallow areas will allow them to get the best environment while providing all the benefits to the pond overall. You can accomplish this a few different ways, like just planting them on a gentle slope of the bottom pond, putting terraces into the bottom of different heights, and even having pillars throughout the pond that provide the shallower depth for your plants. It's really a matter of how you want to handle it, but having actual living plants in your enclosure is something that I highly recommend. Now, let's talk about the water that you'll need for these Pokemon. There are, just like with any other water enclosure, many factors that you have to keep in mind. Temperature is one of the main things, and thankfully they can tolerate a wide array of temps, as you can tell from the parts about the pond freezing over. They can tolerate between 35 degrees Fahrenheit all the way up to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, so long as the temp swings isn't too sharp of a change in too short of a time. That is 1.7 to 29 degrees Celsius for those of you that use that. However, while they can tolerate those temps, the best and optimal temps for them are between the 65 to 75 degree range, which is 18 to 24 degrees Celsius. Honestly, that's a very reasonable range to have to deal with. A few of the other factors that you should keep your eye on are the pH and the ammonia content of the water. The pH should stay between a level of 7 to 8.6 to keep your Pokemon healthy. As for the ammonia, you want to try and keep that as close to 0 as possible. This can be kind of hard, as the Goldeen line produces a lot of ammonia in their waste, so you have to take measures to prevent this from climbing too high. We'll get more into those in the care section of this guide, but for now, just remember that you're aiming for getting rid of as much of the ammonia in the water as possible. And you can easily keep track of most of the things with tests that you can buy online and thermostats for the temperature. Lastly is that you may want to add in a few features like waterfalls and streams that feed and help to circulate the water. Not only does this help prevent algae from growing in the water, as moving water makes it much harder for things to grow, it also helps to oxygenate the water as well. I know we often think of water-type Pokemon breathing water through their gills, but what they're really doing is pulling the oxygen content from the water using their gills to breathe. Adding these features to help put oxygen back into the water will obviously help them keep breathing, and we won't have to worry about the water becoming toxic over time. As well, these features are very pleasing to watch and look at, so it'll make coming to the pond an even more enjoyable experience for you than it would be otherwise. The next question is, what Pokemon can be housed with the Goldeen line? The short answer is that you should really avoid any other species in the pond. We'll talk more about this in the care section, once again, but these Pokemon like to ram each other and other creatures with their horns. Having any other Pokemon with them will probably lead to those Pokemon getting hurt. And then, if the Pokemon that they ram into has a temper, then you might have a full-blown fight on your hands. They do well with their own kind, though. It's recommended that you have a school of at least 5, and yes, they will still ram each other with their horns, but it won't be as big of a deal with each other as it would be with other Pokemon. Goldeen and Seaking's biologies are well designed to handle the horn impacts, so you shouldn't have to worry about them too much. One thing you should keep in mind with Seaking is that you have a male and female Pokemon, then they might breed, and if that happens, Seaking burrow holes in the ground where they can lay their eggs, meaning they'll drill right through that liner that you put down. Just something to be aware of when you put these Pokemon together. Availability. Being freshwater Pokemon makes their availability more spotty than things that thrive in the ocean, but as we'll see in the catchability section, that actually makes them easier to catch. That's not to say they aren't common. They can be found in most bodies of fresh water in their homes of Kanto and Johto. Even outside those two regions, there are many places where these Pokemon thrive. There's the southern peninsula of the Unova region, my home turf, if you will, as well as the east and south part of the Sinnoh region, my new home, and they're scattered throughout the Hoenn and Galar regions. I'm not going to list out all the places that can be found in those regions, as I'd just be sitting here listing out route numbers and place names. So if you decide to go looking in these places, then you'll have to do a bit of research on your own. However, I can tell you that in Kalos, you'll be looking on routes 3 and 22. I also have records of there being some in the ponds at Parfum Palace, but considering that's private property and the Pokemon there are probably owned by the estate owner, I would recommend you ask him about that. You might not even be able to catch them, as they might already be tied to a Pokeball. The same with the Alola region, as Goldeen line Pokemon can only be found at Brooklet Hill and Mallet Gardens. Sorry, Alolans, if I butchered that pronunciation. But yeah, if you wanted to go out and get your own Pokemon, then you should have ample opportunity to do so. If, however, you don't feel like going through the effort of catching one of these Pokemon, or you aren't much of a fisherman, then the good news for you is that there are plenty of not only breeders, but full companies that sell these Pokemon. With how popular it is to have these Pokemon in a pond at your home, there are full businesses that breed and raise these Pokemon simply for that reason alone. And there are massive groups of people out there that love to sit and watch these Pokemon swim, meaning that business is a-boomin'. Even if you don't want to go through one of the bigger companies, you can absolutely find a smaller breeder like myself that is more than able to provide for your needs. Getting these Pokemon from the breeder market is going to be as simple as making a few phone calls and setting up a delivery date. Catchability. If you decide you want to catch these Pokemon for yourself, then at least you're going to be dealing with the least dangerous part of fishing. After all, it's not like these Pokemon are deep water Pokemon. They can realistically be caught from the water's edge, so you shouldn't have to deal with the danger of possibly pulling up some super strong horror from the bottom of the ocean. Of course, you should still bring a Pokemon for your protection. After all, Gyarados is nearly an ever-present danger when trying to catch Pokemon no matter where you are, and depending on exactly where you decide to try and catch these Pokemon, there could be other dangers in the area as well. Grass and electric types would be the best to have with you, but realistically the Goldeen line aren't known for their strength, so you won't need something super powerful to deal with them. When you do eventually reel one of these Pokemon in, then a Pokeball should be plenty strong enough for Goldeen and a Great Ball for Seaking. Care. As with any aquatic enclosure that we talk about in this series, the biggest part of how you care for and interact with these Pokemon is going to be cleaning and maintenance of the enclosure. For example, keeping the water clean is going to be a major thing that you do. Cleaning and replacing filtration parts is going to be important, as that's the main way that you're going to be keeping your Pokemon's water looking healthy and clean. Pull out the filter, clean it with a Pokemon-safe chemical, and possibly replace it if it needs to be. When you do this, be sure to offset when you clean different parts of the filter system. If you've introduced the beneficial bacteria to the filter system, then cleaning all of it at once will destroy that colony. By only cleaning a part of the filter at a time, you allow that colony to continue living while also keeping them in check. And, as always with any piece of machinery that you have in your enclosure, be sure to regularly check to make sure that it's running properly and there's no issues happening. To that end, you should also be checking and changing the water at least once a week. This will alert you to any dangerous buildup of material in the water, such as nitrates, acidity, and the ammonia we talked about. The testing should be pretty simple. You can get kits for them online fairly easily, but even if your tests come back good, you should still change out some of the water every 2 to 4 weeks so that the water stays fresh and clean. When you do this, don't do more than a quarter of the total water volume at a time. Introducing too much new water to your pond at once could lead to an issue where you cause shock in your Pokemon's system, especially if your pool water quality has dropped noticeably. If you do notice that the water quality has changed in your test, then you should up the water changing routine to every week and a half and continuously do so until your tests come back to normal levels. And lastly, for cleaning, you'll have to remove things from the water's surface. Sunshine is an important part of a healthy Goldeen pond's ecosystem, and as such, things like algae, fallen leaves, and leftover food should be removed from the surface. You can use a simple pool skimmer for this, but it will have to be done at least once a day, so best to get into the habit early. As well, any plants that grow too large and reach the surface should be trimmed back, as to not block the sunlight from the rest of the pond bottom. Moving on to food, the majority of the food that you're going to find for these Pokemon is going to be store-bought, man-made flake foods, and generally things that are optimized for your Pokemon's health. And in reality, those are absolutely fine to feed your Pokemon in this case. Of course, do your research on the brand and how good their food is, but overall they'll be fine, and a flake food will probably end up being cheaper and more accessible than a natural diet. As well, each type and brand of food has their own serving size and recommended feeding schedule, so be sure to look that up as well when you finally decide on a brand. However, for those of you that want to avoid processed food for these Pokemon, you do have a few options. In the wild, Goldeen and Seaking are both omnivores. They use their horns to dig through the mud on the bottom of their pond, pulling up plants, roots, and seeds, but also eating any insect Pokemon that they find there. And so, you can feed them a mixture of seeds and meat. As for the amounts, I don't really know what to tell you. Because every diet I found online talks about using the flake food, there really isn't any research on how much and when to feed them a more natural diet. I'm assuming that they would be able to somewhat feed off the natural environment thanks to the plants that you've planted on the bottom of the lake and the natural prey they get from bugs that fly down and land on the surface of their pond. So the best I can offer for those of you that want to give a natural diet is to record how much your Pokemon eats with each meal. This may lead to wastage as you throw food into the pond they don't eat, but it really is the best way to zero in on how much you're going to need to feed for each feeding. And then, no matter what kind of feeding you decide to do, you'll have to skim and clean the top of the water to get any food that your Pokemon doesn't eat. If it's left there, it'll eventually become sources of bacteria growth that can impact the health of your Pokemon and the pond's ecosystem in general. As for how you're going to interact with the Pokemon, they're actually very intelligent Pokemon. For fish, anyway. Same for any Pokemon, the key to forming a good bond with them is through patience, consistency, and gentleness. By constantly approaching the edge of the pond and just hanging out, spending time near your Pokemon, they'll eventually begin to see you as less of a potential predator and more as a welcome caretaker. Food will, of course, help this along. The more you feed your Pokemon without having a negative experience, such as startling them, the more they will associate you with that positive stimuli. And as the bond begins to get stronger and solidify, you'll even be able to do things such as sit down by the water and place your hands in the water without startling the Pokemon away from you. It will just take time to get to that point, and they will flee from you if you try to do it too early, which can be harmful to the formation of the bond. Wait until the Pokemon begin to approach you when you get to the pond's edge, and go slow when you put your hands into the water. Patience is the key with this. Which does bring me to 2 points. One is that hand feeding these Pokemon is a very common thing for owners to do. Once you have the bond with the Pokemon to the point where they don't scatter when your hand enters the water, you can actually place the food in your palm and have the Pokemon come up and eat it out of your hand. They don't have any teeth, so there isn't any risk of you losing a finger that way, and this practice will also help the bond between the two of you get stronger as they recognize you won't grab at them or hurt them. Eventually, they may even let you pet them as they swim by. However, I should mention that there is still some slight danger with this practice. Goldeen and Sea King horns are very sharp, and they have no issues ramming into things that they feel shouldn't be in their space. If you place your hand in the water before the Pokemon are comfortable with you being there, there's a decent chance that one of them might feel threatened enough to ram you with their horn. Depending on how hard the Pokemon hits you and where they get you, then this may require a trip to the hospital and possibly even something like stitches. Even when the Pokemon is comfortable with you being around them and placing your hands in the water, they may make a sudden movement and catch you with that horn. So if you decide to interact with your Pokemon in this way, then I feel I should make you aware that doing so does present a risk to your safety, marginal as it might be. Also, if you do get cut in the pond, then you'll have to start changing the water out to try and get the blood out of the water as fast as possible. Which, I'm going to tell you this right now, that is going to suck having to do with an injured hand. And I feel like this should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, don't swim in the pond. I don't care how comfortable you and the Pokemon are with each other, that's just a step too far. Not only could you be introducing bacteria and chemicals into the water that could be on your body and clothing, but now it's not just your hand that's at risk of getting pierced by a horn. And nobody wants to be known as the guy that had to go to the doctor because a Goldeen stabbed him in the chest. Let's be smart about this, people, please. Cost. Thankfully, the Pokemon isn't going to be too much money. Like I said, because of their popularity, there are plenty of companies and breeders out there that produce and sell these Pokemon. Of course, they are considered a luxury or vanity Pokemon, thanks to their popularity and beauty, so the price isn't too low. Realistically, you're probably looking at about the moderate category to stock your pond, maybe a bit more depending on how many you decide to get. The food won't be that bad even if you decide to go with the natural diet. The flakes you can buy in bulk quantities, meaning that you can save quite a bit of money by doing so. As for the more natural side, you're obviously going to have to spend more just because you're actually buying things like meat, seeds, and plants. Really, what's going to cost you a bunch with these guys is the fact that you should have a couple of them per enclosure. Between the two ways you can feed them and having to feed multiple Pokemon, I don't see you spending more than the moderate category to the high category for a Goldeen, and definitely into the high category for a Sea King. Lastly, the enclosure is gonna cost you a pretty penny. Building these kinds of enclosures isn't an easy thing. You can't just dig a hole and put the Pokemon in that. With all the things you need to make the pond viable, with the plants and the filtration and the liner, you're certainly looking at the very high category no matter which evolution you decide to have. Conclusion. In reality, Goldeen and Sea King are decent Pokemon to have, but don't have too many things that stand out about them aside from their physical beauty. They don't take too much effort to care for, and they don't have incredible or outstanding needs in their care or food or enclosure. I really think that these Pokemon make a wonderful decoration piece to any home, and if you can get to the point where you bond with them and are able to actually interact with them without needing to have stitches afterward, they can even become wonderful and highly loved parts of the home. But if you never get to that point, then they might end up being delegated to just a decoration with extra steps. I would really consider how much you're going to invest into these creatures before you go ahead and get them purely because you think they look amazing. Now, I will say that, in my opinion, I very much prefer Pokemon that I can directly interact with on a more personal level, but that's just me. You might have listened to this and come to realize that these easygoing and beautiful Pokemon could quite easily end up becoming the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we go over the star-shaped Pokemon Staryu and its evolution Starmie. Have a wonderful night, everyone. I am so ready for this to be the end of the water type guide gauntlet that started with the horsey line. Normally, it's not so bad. I do one water type guide every now and then we go back to a normal dry land Pokemon. But these past three have had me consistently looking into water ecosystems and the like. For those that have been following this series for a decent amount of time, know I hate deep water and the things that can be found there. They freak me out. Now, the Goldeen line wasn't too bad because they're freshwater Pokemon, but the horsey line was terrible for me to look through, and now the subjects of this guide are even worse, as they are the exact kind of strange, alien biology that makes the deep ocean so unsettling to me. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we're going to be going through the Staryu line, which, of course, includes Staryu and its evolution Starmie. Staryu is a Pokemon whose body shape is a stereotypical 5-pointed star. The body is predominantly a brownish color. However, situated in the center of its body, it has an external organ that looks very much like a gem housed in a golden fitting. It's not actually any of those things, it's just more of the Pokemon's flesh, but it holds an uncanny resistance to it, almost more hardness than normal flesh, but not quite to the point of metal. Staryu is also a decently sized Pokemon, standing at 2.5 feet tall, 0.76 meters, and weighing about 76 pounds, or 34.5 kilograms. When you expose a Staryu to a water stone though, it evolves into a Starmie. Starmie keeps the same base body plan as Staryu, but now it looks like it has a second star-shaped body attached to it from the back. The brown color has been replaced with a deeper purple, and the gem that's situated in the center of its body has grown larger, growing facets like an actual gem. Still, remember, it isn't an actual gem, but the resemblance has gotten closer thanks to the evolution. Starmie has also gotten larger, as most evolutions do, now standing 3.5 feet tall, or just over 1 meter, and weighing an average of 176 pounds, that being an even 80 kilograms. In total, they aren't the biggest water-type Pokemon out there, but they do have strange and alien biology that's really unlike anything that we've covered so far in these guides. Maybe that will lead to some unique challenges that have to be confronted in the care of these Pokemon, and who knows? Maybe those unique quirks will possibly make these Pokemon the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Obviously, we're going to be setting up another aquatic enclosure for these Pokemon. And, much like the Horsey line, it's going to have to be another saltwater enclosure. However, the Staryu line are very sensitive to any small change in their environment on multiple different factors, like salinity, water temperatures, and pH levels. In general, you want to keep the salinity between 1.022 and 1.025. This can easily be checked up upon using a salinity test and should be done at least once a week to ensure that the salt levels stay stable over time. If it starts to get too low or too high, then you may have to start changing out water and introducing new water to balance the levels out and to avoid your Pokemon going into salinity shock, where they get too much or too little salt in their systems. The same can also be said for the temperatures. They like to sit in a very narrow range of temperatures, between 72 to 76 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 to 24 degrees Celsius. That's a very narrow range to have to keep all the water in your tank at. And remember that these Pokemon tend to spend the majority of their time at the bottom of the tank. The cold water settles at the bottom of the enclosure, so you have to make sure that the bottom of the tank reaches at least the minimum temperature. But, considering that these Pokemon tend to go to the surface of the enclosure at night, spoiler alert for the care section I guess, you have to make sure you don't heat the upper water too much trying to heat the bottom up. It's a slight issue that is common among these Pokemon's tanks. The best way to combat this issue is to have a decent circulation in your tank. That way the water is constantly being cycled from the top of the enclosure to the bottom and back again, evening out the temperature. Granted, the good circulation will also be needed to help with other things such as oxygenating the water for your Pokemon and keeping things like algae from growing in the tank. And as for the pH levels, you want to try and keep them around the 8.1 to 8.5 range, which is slightly more on the alkaline or basic side of the scale. However, that doesn't mean that they can withstand sudden changes to their pH, even within that range. These Pokemon are, again, very sensitive to sudden changes like that, meaning that if you notice that the levels are rising or dropping into dangerous areas, then you have to gradually change out the water for them to get the levels back under control. Just suddenly shifting the pH on them can cause them to go into a system shock, and that won't be good. To ensure that you're always on top of this, you should be checking the pH levels about the same as the salinity, about once a week. On to the specifics of the tank itself. For a Staryu, the tank needs to be wide enough for it to move around and to explore the base of the tank, while being deep enough to allow it to swim to the surface at night. In reality, you would probably need an enclosure that is at least 10 feet on a side and at least 4 feet deep. You may be wondering why you need an enclosure that's so big. That's fair, thanks to the fact that their arms don't move that much. A lot of people assume that they don't move around much at all. While you would be right in the fact that their arms aren't that mobile, they are able to move around quite a bit, scouring the ocean floor, or in this case, the tank bottom, in search of food. Hence why it's a more horizontal than it is vertical tank. However, Starmie needs a much larger tank than that. Thanks to the extra part on its body that can spin, they are more able to swim through the water and therefore require more space to do so. Their tank should most likely be the size of your average in-ground pool, being 30 feet on each side and having a depth of at least 6 feet deep. This, of course, means you'll be having to house these Pokemon outside, as I doubt any but the richest of people have the space to put that kind of tank inside their house. This does, unfortunately, mean that you won't be able to keep these Pokemon in regions where the winters can get pretty harsh, as they tend to not do well in colder biomes, but unfortunately there's really no other way to get around that unfortunate restriction. Of course, you'll also need the basic stuff for an aquatic habitat once the tank is set. After this gauntlet of aquatic Pokemon that we've covered in the past few guides, it should all sound very familiar. A filter, something to create a gentle current in the water for the Pokemon, and some ground decorations on the floor of the tank. Since you're going to be using salt water in these tanks, you'll have to make sure that the filter you get is specified for salt water, and you want to avoid getting something that'll make too strong of a current. Starmie might be a great swimmer, but Staryu isn't the strongest swimmer out there, and can easily get caught up in a strong current and then get caught in the corner or against the glass. Some decorations that you can use for the enclosures are things that will give the Pokemon places to explore and places to hide. You want things like rocks, small cave formations, you can use some fake coral, anything along those lines. Don't make the tank too crowded, but by decorating the tank with these things, you give the Pokemon plenty of things to use as enrichment. One special thing that you'll have to make for these Pokemon is to make sure that they're able to see the night sky. During the night, if the sky is clear, these Pokemon will often travel to the surface of the water and their gems will begin to glow and twinkle like stars themselves. When they do this in large groups, it's quite a sight to see, the water beginning to glow red like that. I've even seen it myself a couple times on trips to Tangela town, and even someone with my crippling fear of deep water was mesmerized by how amazing it looked. There is even evidence of Starmie transmitting some form of wave up to the sky, though the exact purpose of that is not known at this time. This fascination with the night sky, as well as the star shape of their bodies, has led to the rumor that these Pokemon are really extraterrestrial creatures. I'm not too sure of that, but what I am sure of is that you'll have to make sure that these Pokemon get a good view of the stars at night. You can do this by having a clear lid for the enclosure, having a top that you can remove and replace, or having something like a mesh on the top. I personally recommend the last option, as it will still allow things like fresh air and light to get into the enclosure without you having to worry about things like leaves or bug Pokemon getting caught in the water. Which nicely brings me to other Pokemon that can be housed with the Staryu line. Because I mentioned them coming to the surface in large groups just a minute ago, it's clear that they do well with others of their own species. And, since these are an entirely aquatic species, clearly anything that can't survive in an entirely aquatic environment is a no-go to house with them. As well, anything that's large enough to take a bite out of a Staryu or a Starmie is going to do so. Even smaller species like the Finneon line will take bites out of a Staryu, so you want to avoid anything like that. I know that technically it won't do any damage to the Pokemon as they have an impressive regeneration rate, but it's still not a comfortable thing to have something munching on you, and should be avoided to keep the Pokemon happy and healthy. Really, the category that you're looking for when trying to find a cohabitant for these guys are small, non-aggressive, herbivorous aquatic Pokemon. Things like Clamperl or Corsola would be good tank mates with them in a tropical-themed enclosure. Though, all of those species would compete with each other for food in the enclosure, so keep that in mind if you do decide to go that route. And always remember that the dimensions and specifications that I provide in this section are only for one member of the subject species. If you decide to increase the number of individuals or increase the variety of Pokemon in the enclosure, be sure to make adjustments as they're needed. Availability. The thing that's nice about these Pokemon is that they have at least a minor presence in most regions. In fact, I think the only regions that don't have a native population of the Staryu line are the Paldea region and mainland Galar. In their home region of Kanto, they only live in some of the northernmost waters, like the Vermilion City shore and just south of Pallet Town. Some old reports have them living in the more southern Cantonian waters surrounding the Seafoam Islands, but I'm not sure how authentic they are, as those waters are pretty cold and can be pretty deep away from the islands. I should also say that they live in places like One Island and Five Island. I know they aren't technically part of the Kanto region, but it's the closest region to them, and I wasn't sure where else to put them. This is also pretty much the pattern they follow for the rest of the regions. Places like the western seas of the Johto region, the shallow waters surrounding Lilycove City and Hoenn, as well as the shallow, warmer waters of Canalave City and Sunnyshore City in the Sinnoh region. There's the waters in the Welle Volcano Park and Alola's Route 7, as well as sometimes showing up on Hano Beach, which, now that I'm looking at, probably isn't that good for them to be out of the water like that. Even my home region of Unova, which is well known for its attempt to keep invasive species out of the ecosystem, has a natural population of these guys on Route 13. And, like I said, mainland Galar doesn't have any of them, but if you travel to the Isle of Armor, then you can find them in the waters of Challenge Beach. So, while not the most widespread of species, you can get to a spot where you can find them without ever leaving your home region. Again, besides Paldeans. You guys will need to go a bit further. And I should say that Staryu are the most common members of this line to find in the wild. Thanks to the fact that they live in shallow waters and natural water stones are often found in deeper parts of the ocean, it's very rare for a Starmie to come about in nature. If you're looking for one of those, then you're going to have to spend a much harder time getting a hold of one of them. As for the breeding scene for these Pokemon, it's not the most robust in the world, but it's also not what I would consider rare in the industry. These are some of the few Pokemon that are confirmed to be genderless, meaning they don't reproduce like the majority of the Pokemon in the world. In Staryu and Starmie's case, they tend to reproduce through a process known as fission, where the Pokemon itself chooses to split itself into two halves, each taking part of the core. From those halves, a new Pokemon can grow as long as the cores aren't excessively damaged at all. I'm sure that surprises many of you, as it's a commonly known fact that these Pokemon can regrow limbs so long as the core is intact. So, if it has to split the core in order to divide, then how does each half regrow into a new Staryu? Well, unlike when being attacked by a predator, the core isn't damaged in the fission process. After all, this is the way the species reproduces. It would be a pretty bad way to raise the population if they ended up harming themselves simply by doing it. But back to the breeding situation, this means the reproduction, along with their relatively simple enclosure needs, means that it's very easy for a breeder to end up with a large population of these Pokemon to sell. That being said, these aren't the most popular Pokemon in the world, so some people don't see them as worth the investment. As well, if you're looking for a Starmie right away instead of a Staryu, then you might have to ask the breeder for that one special. It is a Waterstone evolution, meaning that it can be pretty expensive to just keep a Starmie without being certain someone's gonna buy it. Plus, Starmie just reproduces into more Staryu, so it's not like you can get more Starmie that way. At the end of the day, these guys shouldn't pose any major issues to find for sale so long as you're willing to look farther away than your local area. Catchability. Thankfully, since the Staryu line tends to live in the more shallow places around the world, you can hopefully avoid some of the more dangerous examples of aquatic life. But you are still going to be fishing for these guys, so you always have the problem of possibly running into something you don't expect. Always make sure you have a Pokemon with you to help protect you from any Pokemon that you pull up from the depths, even if it is the Staryu evolution you're expecting. To that end, an electric or grass-type Pokemon would be the best to bring along with you. It will probably end up being the most effective by far. As for the gear you'll need, you shouldn't need anything too expensive or high-end. Something decent enough to handle a few of the stronger Pokemon out there should be good enough. Now, if you don't want to deal with fishing, then you do have the option of trying to wait until night when they come to the surface. Make sure it's a clear night, as they don't tend to do this on a cloudy night when the moon and stars are blocked. When you begin to see the flashing red lights appear just below the surface of the water, that's your chance to throw your Pokeball at them. Just be aware that you are not pulling an individual up from the ocean floor, you're throwing something into a crowd of these Pokemon, and I'll be honest, I don't know if they'll swarm you or flee when they come under attack. Just a heads up on that. On Staryu, a Pokeball or Great Ball would be best, though the former might be a bit underpowered, and if you manage to find one of the rare Starmies out there, then you should absolutely use an Ultra Ball on it. Care. One thing we haven't talked about at all during this guide is how to feed these Pokemon. I mean, they don't even have a mouth, so it's not like you can just throw food in the enclosure like the horsey line. No, these guys are actually filter feeders, feeding on microscopic organisms that float through the water called plankton. Usually, these creatures exist almost everywhere in the ocean and oftentimes are the base of the entire food chain in any given marine ecosystem. And so, you are going to have to feed them to your Staryu evolution, which can be done two different ways. One is that you can just get a live colony of plankton and add them to your Pokemon's tank. The benefit of this is that plankton can help to keep your tank cleaner longer, as they will often eat things like algae, bacteria, and even break down and eat the waste from your Pokemon. Also, if they are well fed, then the colony can keep itself sustained over time, meaning that you wouldn't really have to worry about feeding your Pokemon, as they should be able to feed themselves at that point. The downsides to this are that it can be kind of hard to maintain a viable plankton population in a tank such as these. They oftentimes get sucked into the filter, which of course isn't good for them, and as we'll cover in a second, you're going to have to change out the water of the enclosure to keep it clean, meaning that you're either going to have to go through the arduous task of filtering out the plankton without harming them and placing them back in the water, or just accept that you're going to lose a part of the plankton population when you change out the water and be prepared to add more back in. They will also need a place that they can hide and get away from your Staryu evolution, a place where they can repopulate without being eaten. A small cave or rocky overhang should do the trick for this. Lastly, I know there are plenty of people out there that don't like feeding live creatures to their pets, no matter how small or down the food chain they are. So a live colony of plankton for your Pokemon to feed on can make some people out there not feel comfortable. On the tail of that, the second option is to use powdered plankton that you can add to the water. These are often dried out plankton that have been harvested and are sold in bags or containers of some kind. The major benefit to this kind of feeding is that you don't have to worry about keeping the colony alive. No worrying about them getting pulled into the filter or giving them a safe place to breed. You just have to make sure that you remember to feed your Pokemon every 2 to 3 days and they should be just fine. As for how much of this to feed your Pokemon, well, it's kinda hard to tell. Being filter feeders, we aren't really sure how much they eat over the course of a day, as they can just continuously suck in food as the water moves around them. To that end, always check the instructions for whatever brand powder you buy, and if needed, contact the manufacturer for better instructions. The downsides to this are pretty much the opposite from the other method. The powder can sometimes not entirely get eaten right away, meaning that it can end up turning the water and the tank itself pretty gross. It means that you have to actively remember to feed them instead of just checking to see if the population is stable. And it means that you have to continuously buy the powdered stock when you start to run out. Really, what method you go with is a matter of if you want more complex enclosure or if you want to deal with slightly more cleaning. And speaking of cleaning, that is going to be the other major part of care for these Pokemon, as it is for any aquatic enclosure. To be honest, I've gone over cleaning aquatic enclosures in depth for the last 2 guides that I've done, and I don't think that having 3 videos in a row explaining the same thing over and over again is going to be that entertaining. So for here, I'm just going to blitz through the main talking points, and if you want more in-depth understanding of how to clean an aquatic enclosure, then you can go ahead and check out the Horsey guide I have up, or any other of the tank-dwelling Pokemon that I've done guides on. The first thing that you have to consider is that you'll have to keep the actual equipment of the enclosure clean of things like bacteria, algae, and mold. This means things like scrubbing the tank walls, cleaning the decor along with the bottom with a brush and cleaner, and pulling the filter out of the filtration system and cleaning that. When using a cleaner for the inside of the tank, make sure that the cleaner doesn't have any large amounts of copper in it. Copper, for whatever reason, in the Staryu line has a large effect on cell regulation and cell function, so be sure that the cleaner you have is not only aquatic Pokemon safe, but also doesn't have any copper in it. Also, remember that the feeding method you choose might have an effect on the cleanliness of the tank. Having a living colony of plankton will mean less cleaning required as they eat the bacteria and algae growing on the tank. But when you change out the filter, you might have to deal with a small colony of plankton living in the filter system or having gotten caught in the filter itself. And if you decide to go with the powdered food, then you'll probably have to clean more often than those who have the colony, probably every 2 weeks or so. Also, you'll have to change out the water from the tank and replace it with new water on about the same schedule, every 2 weeks or so. When you do this, you'll only be changing about 20% of the total water, as if you change too much water at any given time, then the different levels of pH and temperature might send your Pokemon into shock, which, as I've mentioned, is never a good thing. Of course, you should be checking the levels of your tank daily, and if they start to get out of whack, then you'll have to begin changing the water a lot more frequently until the levels are back to normal. Also, for those of you that have the live population of plankton, when you change out the water, you'll have to run it through a specialized filter to try and get the plankton out of it, and then put them back in the tank. That, or you could just get rid of them along with the water, but to me it just seems like a waste to get rid of a portion of the population that's supporting your Pokemon. It might be more of a pain in the butt to filter them out, but I think the extra effort is worth it in the long run. One last thing that I wanted to talk about is the whole splitting to reproduce thing. If you are doing things right, then your Pokemon should be well fed and comfortable in their enclosure. Depending on a few different factors, this can lead to the Pokemon to feel like it's time to reproduce. If you end up looking into the enclosure and notice that your Pokemon has split, and you don't want to or don't have the space to keep them, then you have a few options. First, you can capture whichever individual is not tied to the Pokeball you already have, and then release them into an appropriate environment. Don't just release them into whichever body of water turns out to be the closest. Odds are it's not correct. Second, you can try to sell them yourself to someone who is looking for a Staryu evolution. If you do this, then please be sure that you make sure the person has the facilities to properly care for one of these Pokemon. No one likes to see a Pokemon mistreated. And lastly is that you can try to sell or give them to a person or breeder that you got yours from. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't want to simply add individuals into their stock, but they may refuse, so always keep that in mind. Remember that splitting is certainly something that can happen with these Pokemon, and should be something that you're prepared to deal with at any time. Best to always be prepared and not need to be than to be caught unprepared. Cost. The Pokemon itself isn't going to be too bad. Sure, there may not be an abundance of people that are selling them, but thanks to the ease in which they replicate and the fact that their enclosures and food aren't that bad to maintain, the people that do sell them tend to keep the price more in the low category. Though, keep in mind that if you want to buy a Starmie, then that price could go up to the moderate category to cover the price of the evolution stone needed. Food isn't going to be that bad either. If you decide to go with the live population of plankton, then you'll have an upfront cost that shouldn't go above the very low category per container of live specimen. And if you have to add to the population, then it shouldn't go above that either. As for the powdered stuff, you can buy them in large quantities and store them for later, but it does end up becoming more expensive, being an average price in the low category per month. Really, the trade-off there is that it ends up being more expensive, but you don't have to worry about the live creatures and maintaining their population along with caring for your Staryu evolution. The Enclosure, as always, is going to be the spot where you spend the most money. Staryu's Enclosure, being the smallest of the two, will be less expensive, probably near the top of the moderate price range or the low end of the high range. As for Starmie, that moves up to the upper end of the high category, or, depending on how fancy you want to get and the company you decide to build it for, can go over into the very high category. And for those of you that are wondering what those categories mean, I always make sure to put them in the description of the video below. Conclusion. These Pokemon can make very interesting pets. They aren't like most of the other water types that we've covered in these guides. Actually, now that I think about it, they're a lot like the Grimer line. They divide to reproduce, they have strange and alien biology and behavior, and they even eat a lot of things that other Pokemon ignore. Thankfully though, the one major downside to the Grimer line, their overly toxic nature, isn't present with the Staryu line. Instead, you have a Pokemon line that I think makes a decent Pokemon for someone who has a little bit of experience with keeping aquatic Pokemon and is looking for something unique and interesting to care for. They don't really have any major challenges like a Kingdra, and they aren't dangerous like a Gyarados. If that sounds like something you would be interested in, then I can absolutely see the Staryu line being the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we cover the Psychic Mime Pokemon Mime Jr. and its evolution Mr. Mime. Have a wonderful night, everyone.